to God at Work, Stories of Grace and Faith. I'm your host, CharlesGruver, and this week I've decided to basically take a look at, I would say, the writer of one of my favorite hymns, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, though I guess you kind of could say that about most of these hymns and hymn writers that I'm planning on talking about basically this season. And the writer of Come Thou Fount is Robert Robinson. And kind of like a couple weeks ago when I was talking about Beethoven, he is another one of these hymn writers who in the end, their faith kind of comes into question, which I'll get to later on in the episode. Also, I'll have links to all of the resources I used in the show notes as usual. Robert Robinson was born September 27th, 1735 at Swaltham in Norfolk to Michael Robinson and Mary Wilkin. Robinson's father died while he was still young. Some sources stated that Robinson was 5, others that he was closer to around 8 when this happened. Regardless, Robert Robinson was young at the time. Robinson's uncle basically supported his attendance because of this at a school in Scarming near Dereham in Norfolk under the Reverend Joseph Brett. It was said that Robinson's mother was a godly woman and wanted to see her son as a clergyman in the Church of England. However, basically, poverty prevented that. It kind of goes that when Robinson's mother actually married his father, her father was not, I guess, viewed that marriage as being her marrying someone of a lower status, and essentially disinherited Robert Robinson, leaving him with like an inheritance of pretty much it was just a small, very tiny, almost insignificant inheritance. But because of poverty, at the age of 14, Robinson was sent off to London to apprentice under Joseph Anderson, who was a barber and hairdresser. And during this time, basically, Robinson continued as an avid reader, to which basically Anderson, or his master at the time, found him to be more given to reading than to his profession. There's a story that goes about Robinson joining up with basically some bad companions, and one day they were out and harassed a drunken gypsy, and they were demanding her to tell their fortunes, and at one point she pointed to Robinson and stated that he would live to see his children and grandchildren, which this caused Robinson to really reflect on it. If he was going to live to see his grandchildren, he kind of started reflecting on how he was living and that he kind of needed to change how he was living. But it wasn't until in 1752, upon hearing a sermon by the Methodist preacher George Whitefield on Matthew 3:7, where it says, O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? It was basically after the sermon, Robinson pretty much had left that sermon with a feeling of dread and conviction of his sin that lasted pretty much for 3 years. And at the age of 20, Robinson made peace with God, basically at the end of that 3 years, and set out actually to become a Methodist preacher. He remained in London until 1758, when he was invited as a Calvinistic Methodist to the oversight of a chapel at Middenhall in Norfolk. And then he was later invited to assist at the Calvinistic Norwich Tabernacle, where after a couple of weeks he left the Methodist Church to form a congregational chapel in St. Paul's Parish, also in Norwich. Then in January of 1759, he moved to Cambridge, and the Stoneyard Baptist Chapel, where he pretty much remained for the rest of his life. He served there first as a lecturer, and then in 1762 as a pastor, where under him the congregation actually grew to be more than 1,000. In 1770, he started on basically his writing career, publishing a translation from Sirius's sermons. Then in 1774, he published Arcana, or the Principles of the Late Petitioners to Parliament for Relief in the Matter of Subscription. 1776 saw a plea for the divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ in a pastoral letter to a congregation of Protestant dissenters at Cambridge. This book was actually lauded as an exceptionally able, scholarly, and pungently written book, not only by nonconformists, in other words, those who weren't part of the Church of England, but also dignitaries and clergy of the Church of England really lauded this book. And due to this, and then due to his work, History and Mystery of Good Friday, published in 1777, the Church of England actually invited Robinson to enter the ministry of the Church of England. However, Robinson would not waver from his nonconformity, basically his religious background of being apart from the Church of England. And then finally, in 1781, the Baptists of London asked Robinson to prepare a history of the denomination, which in 1790 resulted in History of Baptism and Baptists being published, followed up by Ecclesiastical Researches in 1792. All of this writing, though, pretty much had Robinson prematurely worn out, and he retired to Birmingham in 1790, where he pretty much encountered the Unitarian Church, and more specifically the Unitarian Joseph Priestley. And on June 6, 1790, he actually preached 2 charity sermons at Priestley's New Meeting Chapel and Old Meeting, Birmingham. Basically did the morning service at the New Meeting Chapel and the afternoon service at the Old Meeting, Birmingham. And then later that week, on Wednesday, the 9th of June, 1790, at the home of a Unitarian benefactor, William Russell, he passed away in his sleep. And it's basically, to an extent, this last section of Robinson's life where his faith really comes into question. And that's because of his relationship with the Unitarians. Because the doctrine of the Unitarians was that they denied the deity of Christ, as well as basically essentially denying the deity of Christ. They denied the Trinity. And it is said that basically Robinson abandoned Trinitarianism and actually began attacking Orthodox doctrine, to where basically these charity sermons at Priestley's congregations, he was said to have ridiculed and mocked the doctrine of the Trinity with sarcasm and invective far stronger than anything Priestley, who by his own admission had ever said or written. To which basically some of the early church leaders the main one that comes to my mind is Tertullian, which I'll have to look to see if I actually ever talked about him in one of my previous podcasts. If not, probably next season I might look deeper at some of the church leaders and talk about him, because he was one that was strong in the faith earlier in his life as a church leader, but then towards the end there is some dispute as to whether he became more of a heretic. But just like some of them, the last verse of Robinson's hymn may just be his testimony, and some might look at the hymn Come Thou Fount as either being autobiographical for him and kind of, to an extent, prophetic when you look at the last verse. In fact, there's one story that's kind of legend. Whether it actually happened or not, it's unsure. But Robinson was traveling later in life, and there was a lady sitting next to him humming a hymn. She was humming Come Thou Fount to herself, and as she finished, she looked up at him and asked a question about the hymn, whether he liked it or not or something, and to which he replied basically about how he wished he could have the faith or something along those lines that he had back then when he wrote it. But the last verse, "O to grace, how great a debtor, daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness, like a fetter, bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, God, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, O take and seal it. Seal it before thy courts above." Again, it's kind of prophetic / autobiographical in regards to Robinson, as there later in life he kind of looks like he pretty much wandered away from God and left the God he loved. But again, this is CharlesGruver on Robert Robinson and Come Thou Fount, and that's God at work.